A few years ago, strange headlines started popping up in the international press. Journalists were writing that Saudi Arabia was supposedly getting ready to build its own version of the Suez Canal. Some articles promised a real revolution in global trade. Others claimed the new route would bypass the Strait of Hormuz and change the distribution of cargo flows between Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. The story sounded so huge that you wanted to believe it. But the more closely I studied the map of the region, the more questions I had. Between the seas they were supposed to connect lay hundreds of kilometers of difficult terrain, and it gradually became clear that the most interesting part of this story wasn't about the canal at all. Most people rarely think about just how vulnerable modern global trade is. There are dozens of important maritime routes on the world map, but some of them are especially significant. If one of these routes is disrupted for even a few days, the consequences are felt far beyond the region. For many decades now, the Strait of Hormuz has been one of those places. From a satellite's view, it looks pretty modest. A narrow strip of water separates Iran from the countries of the Arabian Peninsula. But its simple appearance is deceiving. Huge volumes of oil, petroleum products, and other cargo pass through this channel every single day. For the global economy, Hormuz has long since become one of the planet's key transportation arteries. The strait's uniqueness isn't just about the number of ships. What's much more important is that the countries in the region basically can't get by without it. And this dependence works both ways. The Gulf states send oil to their customers through the strait, but they also get back food, construction materials, electronics, and thousands of other goods along the same routes. The very same transportation artery handles both exports and imports. This is exactly why any news about tension in the Hormuz area instantly grabs the attention of markets all over the world. Over the last few decades, this dependence has only grown stronger. The population grew, cities expanded, and new industrial zones appeared. All of this required a constant flow of goods. The faster the region developed, the more crucial the uninterrupted operation of its sea routes became. That's precisely why the governments of the Persian Gulf countries started looking for alternatives, long before today's megaprojects. But at some point, Saudi Arabia decided to look at the problem from a much broader perspective. In Riyadh, they gradually came to the conclusion that the issue wasn't just about the security of supplies. It was about the future of the country as a whole. If the world eventually becomes less dependent on oil, the kingdom will need a new model for economic development. This is how the strategy known today as Vision 2030 came to be. It's often associated with futuristic projects and massive construction. In reality, however, the idea is much broader. The country's leadership is trying to create an economy that can generate revenue, not just from resource extraction, but also from its position on the world map. If you look at the region's geography, the logic becomes clear. Saudi Arabia is located between several of the planet's largest economic zones. From there, it's relatively convenient to work with the markets of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Few nations possess such an advantageous position at the crossroads of international routes. But an advantageous position by itself doesn't guarantee anything. History has seen plenty of countries that had excellent geography, but never managed to turn it into a serious source of income. This requires infrastructure, investment, and the ability to integrate into global supply chains. This is where the most interesting part of the whole story begins. As you dig into the Saudi projects, it becomes clear that it was never about just one single channel. Behind the splashy headlines lies a much more massive strategy that includes dozens of interconnected elements. One of the most well-known projects in recent years has been NEOM. Thanks to its spectacular presentations, even people who don't typically follow the Middle East's economy have heard of it. Futuristic cities, high-tech, and unusual architecture quickly caught the attention of the global media. However, behind the flashy visuals lies a much more practical calculation. The project's location was not chosen by chance. NEOM is being built near a region through which the most crucial shipping routes between Asia and Europe pass. For investors, this proximity could prove to be just as valuable as any technological innovation. You just have to look at a map to understand the importance of this territory. The Gulf of Aqaba is right nearby, A little further south, the Red Sea begins. Even further is the route to the Suez Canal. Thousands of ships carrying cargo between the world's largest markets pass through these waters every year. But this is precisely where the question that sparked talk of a new canal arises. Saudi Arabia has access to two strategically important maritime basins at once. To the east is the Persian Gulf. To the west lies the Red Sea. At first glance, the idea of connecting these two routes seems quite logical. When I first came across such suggestions, they seemed pretty plausible to me. On a standard political map, the distance between the coasts doesn't look like anything incredible. The country's vast territory almost seems to invite the idea of creating a direct transportation corridor. But then I pulled up a topographic map, and in just a few minutes, it became clear why experts are extremely cautious about projects like this. Instead of relatively flat terrain, what appeared before my eyes were mountain ranges, rocky plateaus, and areas with serious elevation changes. At that moment, the whole story about a new Saudi Suez Canal started to look completely different. On paper, the problem could be solved with locks. That's exactly how many canals around the world operate. A ship is gradually raised to the necessary height, travels along a section of the route, and then is lowered back down to sea level. However, there's a huge difference between theory and practice. The greater the elevation change, the more complex and expensive the entire system becomes. In Saudi Arabia's case, engineers wouldn't just be dealing with a few hills, but with entire mountain ranges. Besides the excavation work, another question would come up. Where would they get the water for a huge number of locks in one of the driest regions on the planet? Even a wealthy nation can't just ignore limitations like that forever. This is precisely why most experts are very skeptical about the idea of a new Saudi canal. The deeper you look into the actual conditions on the ground, the clearer it becomes that this high-profile project exists mainly in newspaper articles and online discussions. The kingdom's real plans are heading in a completely different direction. Interestingly enough, giving up on building the canal doesn't mean giving up on the goal itself. If you look closely at Saudi Arabia's actions over the past few years, you can spot a pattern. The country is trying to solve the same problem using different tools. Not by forcing ships to cross the country by water, but by creating a system that allows cargo to do it over land, quickly and without unnecessary stops. At first glance, the difference seems minor. To the average person, a container is a container, whether it's moving by sea or by rail. But for logistics companies, they are fundamentally different things. Sometimes, saving a few days is more critical than the cost of shipping. This is especially noticeable in high-tech industries. Modern factories increasingly operate on a minimal inventory principle. Companies try to avoid keeping a huge number of parts in warehouses and count on receiving the necessary components at the precise moment they are needed. Any serious delay quickly turns into a production shutdown. Because of this, global trade is gradually changing. While the price of shipping used to be the main criterion almost always, today more and more attention is being paid to the speed and reliability of the route. Some shippers are willing to pay significantly more to shorten transit time than they were just 20 years ago. This is exactly where railroads come into play. Many people are used to seeing them as a domestic mode of transport within individual countries. However, in recent years, more and more nations are viewing rail corridors as a tool for international competition. And this isn't just about transporting passengers. For Saudi Arabia, this opens up interesting possibilities. The country has a vast territory that can be used to create land routes between different parts of the region. If a container can quickly cross the peninsula by rail, some logistical challenges can be solved without building a canal. And we're not talking about just one single route here. A whole network of infrastructure projects is gradually taking shape. New railroad lines are connecting to ports. The ports are getting access to industrial zones, and warehouses, terminals, and cargo processing facilities are popping up around major transportation hubs. This kind of approach has another advantage. A canal is a single entity. If a serious problem comes up, it affects the entire route all at once. A logistics network works differently. It has more options for rerouting flows and adapting to changing conditions. But as soon as you start looking at the bigger picture, it becomes clear that Saudi Arabia isn't operating in a vacuum. Right next door are countries that have been building their own transportation systems for years and have no intention of giving way to a new competitor. First and foremost, we're talking about the United Arab Emirates. Over the past few decades, they've managed to create one of the most efficient logistics infrastructures in the region. Huge volumes of cargo pass through their ports, and many international companies use the country as a major distribution center. The Emirates' advantage isn't just in its modern infrastructure. The experience they've gained is just as important. When a major corporation chooses a shipping route, it doesn't just look at one port or one terminal, it looks at the entire ecosystem at once. Banks, insurance companies, warehouses, customs procedures, and access to international markets. You can create a system like that, but it takes years, and sometimes decades. The fight for logistics supremacy is rarely just about building individual facilities. What's far more important is the ability to turn infrastructure into a single, cohesive machine. If you look at a map of the Middle East, it becomes clear why the competition is so fierce. Every new port hopes to carve out a piece of the existing market. Every transportation corridor tries to convince clients to choose its specific route. There's another player, though, that often stays out of the big discussions. Its projects rarely make the front pages of global publications, but many analysts are watching its moves closely. We're talking about Oman. Compared to its wealthy neighbors, Oman has long seemed pretty modest. They aren't building futuristic cities that cost hundreds of billions of dollars. But sometimes geography turns out to be more important than massive presentations. And in Oman's case, this is especially noticeable. Most of the Persian Gulf states are, to some extent, dependent on the Strait of Hormuz. Oman is in a more advantageous position. Some of its key ports have direct access to the open ocean and can operate without needing to pass through this narrow maritime corridor. When I was digging into this topic, the case of Oman struck me as the most unexpected. Public discussions about Middle East logistics almost always bring up Dubai, Riyadh, big money, and massive construction projects. But a country that just happens to have well-positioned ports gets left on the sidelines of the conversation. Although, for a shipper who wants to avoid unnecessary risks, this quiet alternative might be more important than any mega project. The story of the port of Duqm is a particularly telling example. Just a few decades ago, this place played practically no significant role in international trade. Today, a major industrial district is taking shape around it, complete with terminals, businesses, and transportation infrastructure. For Oman, this is an attempt to carve out its own niche in the region's shifting logistics system. The picture that ultimately emerges is quite complex. Saudi Arabia is building railroads and industrial zones. The Emirates are refining their already functioning ecosystem. Oman is offering routes that bypass the strait. Each of these players is trying to convince international business that its infrastructure is the one worth trusting. And they are all competing for the same thing, for the right to control the future routes of global trade. As a result, it becomes clear that the fight is for a much more valuable resource than it might first appear. Whoever manages to attract a significant portion of the flow will gain not only transit revenues, but also serious political influence. In the modern world, transport corridors have long since stopped being just roads. To understand the scale of what is happening, you need to look far beyond the region's borders. The key decisions about moving goods are not made in Riyadh, Dubai, or Muscat. Very often, they are made in Beijing, Mumbai, Shanghai, or European financial centers. China's role is especially noticeable. In recent years, Chinese companies have invested huge sums in the development of port infrastructure all over the world. For Beijing, transportation routes have long become as strategic a resource as energy or high technology. The more reliably the trade chains operate, the more stable the economy feels. At the same time, China's interests are not limited to just maritime shipping. Across different parts of Eurasia, land routes, railway connections, and multimodal delivery systems are being actively developed. Their goal is not to completely replace sea transport. It is much more important to create additional options in case the situation changes. A similar logic is gradually becoming relevant for India as well. The country's economy is growing rapidly. Foreign trade volumes are increasing, and its industry demands more and more resources and components. The nations of the Arabian Peninsula are located in an exceptionally convenient spot between the manufacturing centers of Asia and the largest markets of Europe. This is precisely why many Indian companies are closely watching the region's infrastructure projects. Interestingly, just a few decades ago, topics like these rarely captured the attention of a wide audience. Ports, warehouses, and railroads seemed like boring subjects that were only interesting to specialists. Today, the situation has changed noticeably. You just have to recall any major disruptions in international shipping in recent years. Their consequences were very quickly reflected in the cost of goods, delivery times, and the operations of businesses all over the world. A huge part of the modern economy rests on a complex system of transportation links, and now everyone can see it. Against this backdrop, Saudi Arabia's actions start to look much more logical. The country is trying to integrate itself into processes whose significance is only growing. And we are not talking about a short-term project for a few years. Many infrastructure decisions are being made with a long-term view, decades into the future. However, this is where an important question arises. What happens if all these investments do not lead to the expected result? History knows many examples of ambitious projects that looked convincing in presentations, but then collided with harsh economic reality. It is significantly easier to build a port than to get international companies to actively use it. It is easier to create a railway line than to fill it with a stable flow of cargo. That is why work in the areas of legislation, attracting investment, and creating a favorable environment for international business is just as important. In logistics, infrastructure without a reputation simply does not work. Meanwhile, global trade never stays the same. Manufacturing hubs shift, consumer markets grow or shrink, and political relationships between nations influence the direction of cargo flows. Add to that port automation, new supply chain management technologies, and constantly changing industry standards. Nations have to make decisions decades in advance, without being completely sure what the world will look like in 20 years. Still, there is one reason why countries continue to pour massive amounts of money into projects like these. History shows that control over important routes has almost always brought significant advantages. Eras, technologies, and modes of transport have changed, but the importance of trade routes has remained. Wealth once centered around caravan roads and seaports. Later, railroads and ocean shipping lanes began to play the most critical role. Today, this function is performed by container terminals, distribution centers, and transportation corridors that connect different parts of the planet. Not too long ago, the Persian Gulf states were primarily associated with oil and gas. It was their mineral deposits that defined their role in the global economy. Today, the picture is gradually becoming more complex. More and more often, it is not the resources underground, but the infrastructure on the surface that is drawing attention. This turned out to be the most unexpected discovery for me in this whole story. You start looking into another news story about the construction of a new canal through the desert, and you end up researching how entire nations are trying to secure a place in the global shipping system. The deeper you dive into the subject, the less the canal itself matters, and the more important the question of the future of global logistics becomes. As it turns out, the talk about a new Saudi Suez Canal was a bit off the mark from the very beginning. The real project isn't about creating a waterway between two seas at all. Instead of one massive structure, Saudi Arabia is building an entire network of interconnected facilities that are meant to work as a single, integrated transport system. The Suez Canal changed global trade not because it was an impressive feat of engineering. It proved to be in high demand because it saved time, resources, and money. Any new transportation corridor faces the same test. In the end, the market doesn't choose the prettiest project. It chooses the most useful one. This is the very test that the Saudi calculation is now undergoing. And if it proves to be correct, the consequences for the entire region could be far more significant than the appearance of just another canal on the world map.